10 years is a long time to share a life with someone without sharing a bed. A decade of splitting bills, of knowing exactly how she takes her coffee, black, 2 sugars, stirred counterclockwise 3 times, of hearing her muffled footsteps through the floorboards at 2 in the morning when she can't sleep. Our apartment wasn't just a living space, it was a carefully constructed ecosystem, a terrarium built for 2 where the climate was always a stable, predictable 72 degrees. I had designed it that way. After Julia, after the spectacular, life-altering implosion of my last relationship, stability was the only thing I craved. Kasia, with her steady hands and even steadier temperament, was stability made manifest. She'd moved in when I was still picking shrapnel out of my heart, a friend of a friend needing a room, and had somehow never left. Our lives had braided together so seamlessly, so platonically, that I'd long since stopped questioning it. It was just the way things were. I had my side of the fridge, she had hers. I wrote my dense, academic papers at the dining table. She sketched designs for her custom furniture in the worn armchair by the window, the scent of cedar and graphite clinging to her like a second skin. It was a comfortable silence, a life lived in parallel. Lonely, if I was being honest with myself in the dark hours before dawn, but safe. Safety was paramount. I wasn't looking for another woman to dismantle my carefully rebuilt world. I wasn't looking for anything. Then, one Tuesday, the ecosystem tilted. Cass came home from the workshop, her hair shorn on one side in a sharp, modern undercut, the rest falling in a soft, dark wave over her eye. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was a change. And in the 10 years we'd lived together, Cass never changed. She was my constant. But as she stood in the doorway, shrugging off her denim jacket and shaking sawdust from her curls, the late afternoon sun caught the newly exposed line of her neck, the delicate shell of her ear, and something in my chest constricted. It was a tectonic shift, a hairline fracture in the foundation of the world I knew. She looked up, caught me staring, and a slow, easy smile spread across her face. "What do you think?" A bit drastic. I could only swallow. The air in the room suddenly felt thin. Drastic wasn't the word. It was revealing. My immediate, instinctual reaction was to rebuild the wall. To reinforce the comfortable platonic boundary that her new haircut had, for some inexplicable reason, threatened to breach. "It's very geometric," I said, my tone drier than I intended. I turned back to the laptop on the dining table, pretending to be absorbed in a particularly dense passage on post-structuralist theory. I could feel her presence behind me, the warmth of her body radiating across the small space. It was a warmth I had grown so accustomed to it had become ambient, ignorable. Now it felt like a focused beam, prickling the skin on my back. "Geometric," she repeated, and I could hear the amusement in her voice. It was a low, melodic sound, like cello strings. "I'll take that as a compliment from you, Alara." She moved past me into the kitchen, the familiar scent of wood smoke and bergamot tea trailing in her wake. I watched her from the corner of my eye as she pulled our favorite mismatched mugs from the cupboard, a chipped ceramic one with a faded museum logo for me, a heavy, hand-thrown stoneware piece for her. The silence that fell between us wasn't the usual comfortable quiet. It was charged, filled with the things I had just noticed and was now trying desperately to unnotice. The way the muscles in her forearm flexed as she filled the kettle, the vulnerability of her nape, the casual grace in her every movement. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, panicked bird. This was dangerous territory. I had spent years cultivating this sterile peace, this emotional ceasefire. The last time I had let myself feel this flicker of attraction for a woman, it had ended in a fire that burned my entire life to the ground. Julia had been a supernova, brilliant, all-consuming, and ultimately destructive. Cass was the earth. Solid, reliable, life-giving. And I was standing on her, taking her for granted, and suddenly terrified of the tremor beneath my feet. "Tea?" she asked, her back still to me. Her voice was normal, completely unaware of the crisis unfolding inside my head. "Please," I managed to choke out, my own voice sounding foreign and strained. I needed to get a grip. It was just a haircut. But as she turned and placed the steaming mug beside my laptop, her fingers brushed against mine. It was nothing. A fleeting, accidental touch. But a jolt, hot and electric, shot up my arm, and I snatched my hand back as if I'd been burned. Cass paused, her brow furrowing in concern. "You okay?" Her eyes, the color of moss after a rain, searched mine. I couldn't meet her gaze. "Fine," I said, too quickly. Just static electricity. It was the lamest excuse in the history of lame excuses, and we both knew it. The universe, it seemed, had a cruel sense of humor. 2 days after the haircut incident, the sky opened up. A storm of biblical proportions rolled in, knocking out the power to our entire neighborhood. The world beyond our apartment windows dissolved into a churning gray chaos of wind and water. Inside, we were plunged into a sudden, profound darkness, and an even more profound silence, broken only by the rattling of the window panes and the frantic thrumming of my own pulse. My first thought was a surge of panic. My laptop was at 7% battery. My meticulously ordered world, governed by deadlines and digital calendars, had just been unplugged. My second thought was of Cass. I found her in the living room, a silhouette against the bruised purple light of the storm. She wasn't panicking. Of course she wasn't. She was calmly lighting candles, her movements efficient and unhurried. The small flames flickered to life, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls and turning her face into a landscape of warm light and soft darkness. She looked like a figure from a Vermeer painting. "Breakers not tripped," she said, her voice a calm anchor in the roaring dark. "Whole grid must be down." She handed me a thick pillar candle. Her hands were steady, her palms warm and calloused against mine as I took it. The calluses were from her work, from shaping stubborn wood into things of beauty and function. I'd never really thought about them before. Now, the texture felt incredibly intimate, a map of her life written on her skin. I spent the next hour watching her. She moved through our shared space with a quiet competence that was both reassuring and, to my newly awakened senses, deeply attractive. She found the battery-powered radio, checked the emergency supplies, and made sure the windows were securely latched. While I was mentally cataloging all the ways my life was about to be inconvenienced, she was simply coping. Adapting. Being. We ended up huddled on the living room floor, wrapped in blankets, the small constellation of candles between us. The outside world had vanished, leaving only this small, flickering pocket of existence. There was nowhere to go, nothing to do. No laptops, no phones, no distractions. There was only the storm, the candlelight, and Cass. I watched the light play over her face, highlighting the strong line of her jaw, the gentle curve of her lips. The new haircut left one side of her face in sharp relief, the other softened by the sweep of her dark hair. I found myself cataloging details with an academic's precision: the tiny scar just above her left eyebrow, the way she chewed on her lower lip when she was thinking, the exact shade of her irises in the wavering light. This was different from the detached cohabitation I was used to. This was observation. This was seeing her. For the first time in a long time, I was truly, completely present with her, and the realization was terrifying. The storm raged on, a relentless percussion against the roof. The candlelight made our small living room feel like a cave, a sanctuary against the wildness outside. The silence, which had felt so charged before, slowly softened, cushioned by the blankets and the rhythmic drumming of the rain. We sat for a long time without speaking, just listening. The absence of electricity had stripped away all the usual buffers, the low hum of the refrigerator, the glow of screens. It was just us. "It reminds me of the blackouts we used to have when I was a kid," Cass said suddenly, her voice soft in the near dark. "My dad would tell us ghost stories, and my brother would hide under the table." A small smile touched her lips. "I always thought it was kind of magical." I had 1,000 questions. I knew so little about her family, her childhood. In 10 years, our conversations had mostly revolved around the mundane logistics of sharing a space, whose turn it was to buy milk, whether the landlord had fixed the leaky faucet. We had shared a home, but we hadn't truly shared our lives. Not the important parts. "My parents just got out the Scrabble board," I offered. My dad always cheated. The admission felt surprisingly vulnerable, a tiny, unpolished stone from my past placed carefully between us. Cass laughed, a low, warm sound that felt like a counterpoint to the howling wind. "Of course he did." The conversation flowed easily after that, meandering through childhood memories and forgotten dreams. The darkness provided a strange sort of anonymity, a permission to speak truths that felt too bright for the ordinary light of day. I found myself talking about Julia. I didn't use her name, but I didn't need to. "I was with someone for a long time," I began, the words feeling thick and rusty in my throat. She took up a lot of space. In a room, in my head. When it ended, the silence was deafening. I think. I think I've just been trying to keep things quiet ever since. I stared into the flame of the candle in front of me, watching the wax melt and pool. I was telling her, in my own oblique way, why I was the way I was. Why I kept my bedroom door closed, both literally and figuratively. Why I had built this fortress of solitude around myself, even with her living just down the hall. I braced myself for a platitude and easy comfort. But Cass was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was laced with an empathy so profound it made my throat ache. Silence can be a shield, she said, her gaze steady on mine. But sometimes it's just an empty room. It must have been hard, building everything back up on my own. The words hung in the air. But I hadn't been entirely on my own, had I? She had been there. A quiet, unobtrusive presence, respecting my boundaries, never pushing for more than I was willing to give. She had been the foundation on which I'd rebuilt, so constant and steady I had forgotten she was there. A wave of guilt washed over me, swift and sharp. I had used her stability, her quiet strength, as a buttress for my own broken walls, without ever once considering the person holding it all up. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving a world washed clean and eerily silent. The power, however, remained off. Cass, ever practical, decided to make coffee on the gas stove. I followed her into the kitchen, drawn by her quiet energy. The room was filled with the gray pre-dawn light, making everything look soft and undefined. She moved with a familiar economy, grinding the beans by hand in a small, old-fashioned mill. The rhythmic crunching and the rich, dark smell of the coffee filled the small space, a comforting ritual in the midst of the disruption. You know, she said, not looking at me as she measured the grounds into the percolator, my grandmother taught me how to do this. She said there's no sense in letting a machine have all the fun. She spoke of her grandmother, of summers spent on a small farm in the countryside, of learning how to identify birds by their song and trees by their bark. She painted a picture of a life so different from my own urban, academic existence. She talked about her dream of one day having her own workshop, a big, airy barn with high ceilings and light pouring in, where she could build things that would last for generations. As I listened, I realized how one-dimensional my portrait of her had been. Cass, the steady roommate. Cass, the furniture maker. Cass, the constant. I had never considered the intricate details, the hidden longings, the rich history that made up the whole person. She was sharing pieces of herself with me, reciprocating the small, hesitant vulnerability I had offered her by candlelight. She was inviting me in. She sounds amazing, I said, my voice a little hoarse. She was, Cass agreed, a fond, sad smile on her lips. She's the one who gave me my first whittling knife. Said I had clever hands. My parents wanted me to be a lawyer. She chuckled, a dry, self-deprecating sound. Can you imagine? I tried and failed. I couldn't picture her in a tailored suit, arguing in a courtroom. I could only see her like this, hair falling in her eyes, a smudge of what looked like charcoal on her cheek, her clever hands confidently tamping down coffee grounds. Hands that could create beauty and function from a block of raw wood. Hands that had been a steady, comforting presence in my life for a decade. The percolator began to gurgle on the stove, a cheerful, domestic sound. The intimacy of the moment was palpable, a fragile bubble in the quiet morning. We were just two women in a kitchen, waiting for coffee. But it felt like so much more. It felt like the beginning of a conversation that had been waiting 10 years to happen. This newfound trust was a delicate, terrifying thing. It made me want to lean in, to ask for more, but the muscle memory of self-protection was strong. I held my ground, clutching my empty mug, a silent observer on the edge of a world I was only just beginning to understand. The power came back on that afternoon with a sudden, jarring hum as the refrigerator kicked to life. The lights flickered on, banishing the soft shadows and flooding our apartment with a harsh, unflattering glare. The bubble was broken. We blinked at each other, like creatures emerging from a cave into the bright sun. The world rushed back in, emails, deadlines, the relentless tick of the clock. I retreated to my office, to the safety of my work, but the spell of the blackout lingered. The memory of our conversations, of Cass's face in the candlelight, was superimposed over the academic text on my screen. I couldn't focus. Something had irrevocably shifted between us. Later that week, I was struggling to reach a book on the highest shelf in the living room. It was a heavy art history tome I needed for a citation. I was balancing precariously on a stool, my fingers just brushing the spine, when Cass came up behind me. Whoa, careful, she said, her voice close to my ear. Don't need you breaking a hip. Before I could protest, her hands were on my waist, steadying me. Her touch was firm, impersonal, meant only to prevent me from falling. But it wasn't impersonal to me. A current of heat shot through me, sharp and undeniable. My breath hitched. I froze, my hand still outstretched towards the bookshelf. Her body was a solid, warm presence behind me. I could feel the gentle rise and fall of her chest against my back. The scent of her, that unique combination of cedar, bergamot, and something else, something uniquely her, filled my senses. I've got you, she murmured. Her voice was a low rumble that vibrated through me. I leaned back, just a fraction of an inch, into her strength. It was an involuntary movement, a surrender. My mind was screaming at me to pull away, to make a joke, to shatter the intensity of the moment. But my body wouldn't obey. For a single, breathless moment, we stayed like that. Me on the stool, her hands firmly on my waist, the space between us charged with a decade of unspoken things. Then she shifted, reaching around me. Her arm brushed against mine, bare skin against the soft cotton of my sleeve. With an easy grace, she plucked the heavy book from the shelf and placed it in my hands. Her fingers grazed mine as I took it. Our eyes met. Her moss-green gaze was unreadable, but I saw a flicker of something in their depths, surprise. Confusion. Recognition. It was gone as quickly as it appeared. She stepped back, putting a respectable distance between us. The air rushed into the space she had occupied, feeling suddenly cold. There you go, she said, her voice a little rough. She cleared her throat and gave me a small, tight smile before turning and walking back towards her room. I stood there, my feet planted on the stool, clutching the heavy book to my chest. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. It wasn't static electricity. It wasn't a trick of the candlelight. It was real. And it was terrifying. And a small, treacherous voice whispered from a place I had long kept silenced, it was wonderful. The week that followed was an exercise in exquisite torture. Every mundane interaction became fraught with a new, thrumming tension. Passing in the narrow hallway was no longer a simple navigation of shared space. It was a high-stakes negotiation of proximity, a dance of avoiding and seeking contact. I became hyper-aware of her in a way that was all-consuming. I could tell which room she was in just by the quality of the silence. I learned the specific creak of the floorboard outside her bedroom door, the soft thud of her sketchbook hitting the coffee table. Her presence was a constant, low-grade hum beneath the surface of my days. I would be writing, lost in the driest of academic prose, and the scent of the citrus anclove soap she used would drift down the hall, and my train of thought would derail completely. I'd find myself staring at a sentence, the words blurring, my mind filled instead with the image of her hands, the strength in them, the gentleness. We spoke in clipped, functional sentences. Did you get the mail? We're out of coffee, don't forget to take out the recycling. Each word was a carefully chosen brick, rebuilding the wall that the storm and the nearfall from the stool had damaged. But the foundation was compromised. The mortar was weak. I could feel the electricity crackling in the spaces between the words. One evening, I came out of the shower, wrapped in a towel, and found her in the kitchen. She was wearing one of my old university sweatshirts, the gray one with the faded crest that I hadn't seen in years. It was too big for her, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows, the soft, worn fabric draping loosely over her frame. She looked so comfortable, so at home in my clothes, that the sight of it stole the air from my lungs. She looked up and saw me, and a faint blush crept up her neck. Sorry, she said, gesturing to the sweatshirt. Mine were all in the wash. No, it's fine, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I clutched my towel tighter. It looks good on you, the compliment hung in the air between us, shimmering and dangerous. Her blush deepened. She gave me a small, shy smile that made my stomach do a slow, dizzying flip. I fled to my room, my heart pounding, and leaned against the closed door. This was unsustainable. This tightrope of yearning and fear was going to snap. I was living with a ghost and a siren all at once, the ghost of the comfortable, platonic life we'd had, and the siren song of a future that both terrified and thrilled me. I was losing the war against myself. My carefully constructed peace was in ruins, and I didn't know if I had the strength to rebuild it, or if I even wanted to anymore. It happened on a Friday. It had been a long, brutal week, and my nerves were frayed to the point of transparency. I was in the kitchen, staring into the open refrigerator, pretending to look for something to eat, but really just hiding from my own thoughts. I felt a familiar presence behind me, and I straightened up, turning to face her. Cass stood in the doorway, her expression etched with a soft concern. "Tough day?" she asked quietly. I just nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. I couldn't articulate the swirling mess of frustration and anxiety from work, let alone the tidal wave of emotions that was her. All I could do was stand there, feeling small and fragile. She moved closer, her steps slow and deliberate. She didn't say anything else, just reached out and gently took my hand. Her thumb stroked the back of my knuckles, a simple, soothing gesture that somehow unraveled the last of my composure. A single tear escaped and traced a hot path down my cheek. "Hey," she whispered, her voice impossibly gentle. She used her free hand to cup my face, her thumb brushing away the tear. Her touch was everything I had been terrified of and everything I had been craving. It was warm and solid and real. I leaned into her palm, my eyes fluttering shut. All the walls, all the fear, all the carefully constructed defenses crumbled to dust. There was no more hiding. "Elara," she breathed, her voice thick with a decade of unspoken emotion. I opened my eyes. She was so close, the space between us was non-existent. I could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes, could feel the warmth of her breath on my lips. The world narrowed to this single point, this moment suspended in the soft glow of the kitchen light. Then, she closed the final inch between us. Her lips were soft, hesitant at first, a question. And I answered by kissing her back, by pouring all the years of loneliness, of yearning, of quiet, unacknowledged love into that one touch. It wasn't a fire. It wasn't a supernova like Julia. It was a slow, deep warmth, like embers finally being allowed to glow. It was the feeling of coming home to a place I hadn't even known I'd been searching for. It was everything. We broke apart, breathless. Foreheads resting against each other, we just stood there in the middle of the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. The world had tilted on its axis and settled into a new, terrifying, wonderful alignment. I started, but my voice failed me. What could I possibly say? "Me too," she whispered, as if she could hear the chaotic symphony of my thoughts. For a long time, Elara, my phone buzzed on the counter, a harsh, intrusive sound. We both flinched. The caller ID flashed, Maya. My sister. Of course. The outside world, demanding entry. I ignored it, but it buzzed again, insistent. With a sigh, I stepped away from Cass, the loss of her warmth an immediate ache. I answered, my voice shaky. "Hey, Maya, Ellie." Finally. "Listen, Aunt Carol wants to know if you're bringing a +1 to the wedding. She says she has that nice accountant, Mark. She wants to set you up with if you're not seeing anyone." The words were a blast of cold air, a reminder of the world's expectations, of the neat little boxes everyone wanted to put me in. I looked across the kitchen at Cass. She was watching me, her expression open and vulnerable, her heart in her eyes. In that moment, the choice was so incredibly clear. I took a deep breath. "No, Maya. Don't set me up with Mark. I'm not available." I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to. It was enough. It was a line drawn in the sand. I was choosing this. Us. When I hung up, Cass was smiling. A real, brilliant smile that lit up her whole face. She closed the distance between us again, and took my hands in hers. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee. I lay in bed for a moment, disoriented, the events of the previous night feeling like a vivid, impossible dream. But the feeling of hope in my chest was real, a warm, unfamiliar glow. I walked into the kitchen, and the scene was both perfectly ordinary and completely transformed. Cass was standing by the stove, wearing my old gray sweatshirt again, patiently waiting for the percolator to finish. The morning light streamed through the window, catching the sawdust that always seemed to be clinging to her hair, making it sparkle like gold dust. She turned as I entered, and the smile she gave me was soft and intimate, a secret shared between us. She handed me my mug, the chipped museum one, already filled. Our fingers brushed, and this time, I didn't pull away. I let my fingers linger against hers, soaking in the warmth. We didn't need to say anything. The quiet that settled between us wasn't empty or safe, it was full. It was full of 10 years of shared history, and the promise of a new beginning. I took a sip of coffee, the taste familiar and comforting, yet entirely new. Everything was. I looked at this woman, this beautiful, steady, patient woman who had waited for me to find my way out of the silence, and I knew that the lonely, carefully guarded life I had built for myself was over. The terrarium had shattered, and in its place, something real, and wild, and wonderful was finally being allowed to grow. Have you ever had to choose between the safety of being alone, and the terrifying, beautiful risk of letting someone truly see you? If you enjoyed this story of quiet revelations and long overdue love, please give this video a like, subscribe for more stories about women loving women, and share your thoughts in the comments below.